I'd like to start by saying good evening to everyone. Here we are at the final session of the 14th International Symposium organized by 4T. After 2 full days of presentations, we're still excited for we are about to conclude with our keynote speech today, keynote address. And today I have the honor to introduce you two very prolific scholars, and I would like to underline very prolific here, scholars who are joining us from the United States. And when we were discussing among us for keynote speakers, Caitlin and Mohammed's recent efforts in starting the Epidemic Urbanism Initiative as a critical response to the COVID pandemic immediately stood out. So we reached out to them. And they were on top of the list, and they accepted immediately. So we didn't really had to look hard for other keynote speakers. So we are really happy, and we'd like to thank them again for accepting our invitation. It's a great pleasure to have them here. We had a little bit of confusion about the time of the keynotes because of the time difference between the US and Turkey, but we cleared it out, and here we are. I just want to introduce you short biographies of Caitlin and Mohammed, and then I will hand out the floor to them. Caitlin de Klerk is currently an Assistant Director of Graduate Student Programs and Services at the Center for Teaching and Learning at Columbia University in the city of New York, US. She earned a PhD in architecture from the University of California, Berkeley, with a special emphasis on social and cultural factors in architecture, and an MS in teaching and curriculum with specialization in health professions education from the Warner Graduate School of Education at the University of Rochester. That was a bit difficult to put one after the other. Prior to joining the Center for Teaching and Learning at Columbia, Caitlin served as a research fellow at the Interdisciplinary Center for Healthy Workplaces at the University of California, Berkeley, where her research centered on identifying user-defined built correlates to 7 evidence-based drivers of psychological need satisfaction, right? Did I put it correctly? Okay. Caitlin's work on the history and practice of healthy campus design has been included in edited volumes and journals such as Experiencing Architecture in the 19th Century, Buildings and Society in the Modern Age by Bloomsbury, Planning for Higher Education. She's the author of a forthcoming volume, Building Sound Bodies for Sound Minds, Architecture, Pedagogy, and Student Sedentary Lives. Well, this biography misses the edited project on epidemic urbanism, which actually Ishalai and I were gladly a part of, and the book is coming very soon. Along with Mohammed, she is the co-founder of Epidemic Urbanism Initiative and co-editor of that was at the very end, of Epidemic Urbanism, Contagious Diseases in Global Cities, which is coming out of Intellect in 2021. Sorry, I forgot that. Going on to Mohammed. Mohammed Garipur is a professor and chair of the Department of Graduate Studies at the School of Architecture and Planning at Morgan State University in Baltimore, USA. He obtained his PhD in architecture at Georgia Tech, Atlanta, USA. He has received awards and fellowships from several organizations, including the National Endowment for Humanities, Society of Architectural Historians, American Institute of Architects, Foundation for Landscape Studies, Fulbright Hayes, Council of Educators of Landscape Architecture, and Fulbright. He is the editor, co-editor, and author of 13 books, including Bazaar in the Islamic City by the American University of Cairo Press, 2012, Persian Gardens and Pavilions, IB Tauris, 2013, Sacred Precincts, Barbrill in 2014, Historiography of Persian Architecture from Routledge, 2015, Urban Landscapes of the Middle East, again from Routledge in 2016, Synagogues of the Islamic World, Edinburgh University Press, 2017, Gardens of Renaissance Europe and the Islamic Empires, Pennsylvania State University Press, Social Housing in the Middle East, Indiana University Press, 2019, Health and Architecture from Bloomsbury this year, and Epidemic Urbanism, again coming from Intellect this year. Mohammed is the co-founder of Epidemic Urbanism Initiative, as I mentioned, and the director and the founding editor of the International Journal of Islamic Architecture, with Kıvanç as one of the associate editors, who's one of our members, and they have been working together for a while now, which I really wanted to add. I hope I didn't make any mistakes as I was introducing you. So I will hand the floor to our keynote speakers, and I wish there was an applause button in Zoom so that you could hear our applause from over here. So thank you very much, Caitlin and Mohammed, and we'll be listening to you.
Hello, thank you so much for your kind introduction. Before we begin, we want to thank the conference organizers, Bahar Emgin, Erdem Ertem, Batuhan Taneri, Gizem Yazici, and Emre Yildiz for inviting us to be here today. And we want to offer our sincere congratulations on the convening the timely and critical conversations this symposium inspires. We are honored to be part of this effort and appreciate this opportunity to see our work through a new lens, that of care. So as we introduce ourselves and our talk, we would love to get a sense of who you all are and where you are joining us, where you are joining from. That in mind, please take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat, your name and institution. In the time we have together today, we wanted to share with you the origin, contributions, and the next steps for the Epidemic Urbanism Initiative, an interdisciplinary research and education collaborative we founded in March 2020, which now includes more than 1,900 members from more than 90 countries. And to frame these efforts within broader paradigms of intervention and care. We will also be excited to hear from you, to think with you about how we, and in particular the initiative, might continue working in new directions to better prevent and more justly intervene in future epidemics. So we will build in time at the end of our session to hear your ideas. Please also feel free to put your questions and suggestions into the chat at any time. So the story of the Epidemic Urbanism Initiative is one of collaborations at many scales. And our collaboration that between Caitlin and myself began in 2018 when we were introduced by a mutual friend who knew that two of us shared an interest in health and the built environment. In our respective work, we sought to center health in architectural history and practice, which, if we can remember the pre-COVID times, was not always an easy sell. In fact, we have several conference and paper rejections we can point to if you don't believe us. In 2019, we began working together to convene a conference panel for the European Architectural History Network's 2020 conference, which was entitled Public Health in the Early Modern City, Salutogenesis Through Architecture. Our premise was simple. Despite the long history of urban planning and architecture being leveraged toward explicitly salutogenic or health promoting goals, this relationship was largely obscured in architectural history. So this panel sought to situate the development of early modern cities within the health promotion frameworks by explicitly the profound and complex ways that architecture and landscape design were conceived of and employed as instruments of health promotion in the development of urban infrastructure, institutions, and spaces in Western and Eastern societies in the 16th to 18th centuries. Jason Coburn, among others, have chronicled the more recent modern and twin histories of public health and city planning in an effort to rejoin the two in service of healthier cities. Though our panel centered on the early modern period, it was a similar call to action, we hoped, a chance to make explicit the value of a health-centered approach as a means to enrich architectural and urban histories, and also to help inform present-day approaches to the built environments. Yet by February 2020, just a month before we were scheduled to present this session, the world was quickly changing with the devastating global outbreak of COVID-19. Our panel, and indeed the EHN conference, like all other academic gatherings, was canceled as part of an effort to stem the transmission of this disease we knew so little about at the time. Ever mindful of our mission to center public health and feeling in an era of social distancing, the need for connection more acutely than ever, we knew we wanted to still convene a conversation as an effort to connect and share our ideas, if nothing else. But as COVID-19 continued to ravage our cities, our communities, our daily lives, it demanded we think beyond the EHN conference. Indeed, we were seeing play out in real time that historians had long been documenting the vulnerability of urban settings to epidemic illnesses. So in March 2020, we decided to convene a symposium to showcase these past case studies so we could learn from them. The outcome was our May 2020 symposium, Epidemic Urbanism, Reflections on History, which brought together academics from a range of disciplines, architecture, history, medicine, anthropology, and archaeology, to name a few, to present case studies of epidemic illnesses from across the globe to demonstrate how cities throughout history have been not just a primary place of exposure and quarantine, but also the site and instrument of intervention. Meeting online is so commonplace now. It's difficult to remember how new it felt at that time. We were excited about the possibility of showcasing scholars from across the world and of broadcasting the conversation across diverse times, geographies, and disciplines, and to do so for free without the burden of fees or travel. We learned how to navigate Zoom webinars and YouTube live streaming. We managed our own registration process and reached out to organizations, email lists, news outlets, and any place we could think of to spread the word. We were thrilled to receive more than 30 entries in just a matter of weeks. And we organized the selected case studies into 4 themes: urban governance, urban infrastructure, urban life, and urban design and planning. As we later reflected in the introduction to our forthcoming book, Epidemic Urbanism, as we mentioned, it was just published a day ago, the work of this symposium and the simultaneous worsening of the COVID-19 pandemic put into stark, urgent perspective the need to study epidemics and pandemics as a means to understanding and responding to the many crises provoked by the societal, institutional, infrastructural, and professional impacts of contagious diseases within urban settings, and to engage public, practitioner, and academic audiences in this discourse. What we learned from these initial presentations and our simultaneous observations and experiences of COVID was this. First, this pandemic was and is a shared global experience across time and diverse geographies, and one of collective global vulnerability felt and experienced locally. This was an important reminder that we are not immune, and in fact, with inequity, climate change, increased globalization and urbanization, we are increasingly susceptible as an antidote to any hubris we may feel after emerging from COVID-19. Second, the centering of these case studies within built urban settings offered additional insights. For example, that epidemics affect regional and international commerce and trade, that epidemics affect build forms at many scales, and that epidemics spur major planning projects. Yet more importantly, and seen together, these case studies provided further evidence that epidemics are not random acts of God or greater equalizer, to echo both Dr. Richard Jackson and Dr. Frank Snowden. Rather are disasters that extend from, exploit, and amplify social and spatial inequalities. Despite so-called medical advances or any narratives of social progress, we saw time and time again, and even more profoundly against the backdrop of COVID-19, that we are quoting again from the introduction to epidemic urbanism. With every epidemic outbreak comes novel interventions, new vaccines or treatments, and new insights from public health, about public health. Yet in nearly every case, the same persistent and pernicious social inequalities are little changed and potentially exacerbated by so-called colonial improvements or ostensibly modern city planning schemes. Epidemics expose the vulnerabilities of the societies they befall. However, despite centuries of outbreaks and interventions, we have yet to truly implement changes based on this. Before we move to the next part of our presentation, where we talk about the founding of our initiative, we wanted to take a few moments to hear from you. What to you have been primary lesson you have taken from COVID-19, thinking about past and present? So having these case studies and connecting with people across the world during this shared global crisis was also a way to bear witness, not just to history, but to local current experiences. This was a transformative experience. We closed our May symposium by outlining reflections on our role and shared responsibilities in the COVID and post-COVID age, as provoked by these presentations. We shared them here in brief to give context and shape to our initiative. Despite technological advances, the basic response to COVID was strikingly similar to case studies from the medieval and early modern periods. History is not just about the past, but also about the present and the future. Hence, we need to invest in and pay attention to history. It is our contention that history matters as an academic practice as well as a social and public health practice. Understanding epidemics and interventions in the past will allow us to make better, more informed, more effective, and more just interventions in the future. All scholars in all fields need to be engaged in the discourse of pandemics, especially in humanities. We have a moral imperative to go beyond silos of disciplines and the academy and to collaborate. Essential to this spirit of collaboration is the need to share knowledge and resources across continents as well as across disciplines. We need to think globally. Additionally, we learned from the process of convening this symposium. What we learned from the process of convening this symposium is the importance of community building, of collegiality, of connecting across geographic and disciplinary borders. Speaking personally, this gave us a sense of purpose, resilience, and hope in an otherwise impossible time. These ideas set out a trajectory for the Epidemic Urbanism Initiative. Our guiding principles in funding this initiative were and are a commitment to public education, commitment to global reach, a commitment to interdisciplinary collaboration, commitment to empowering a community of junior and senior scholars, practitioners, policymakers, and members of the public, and commitment to changing practices finding new ways to work. Over the last 18 months, these principles have guided the work of the initiative. And in the next part of our talk, we want to give an overview of how we have worked toward these ideas.
Thank you. So beginning with our commitment to publicly accessible information and educational materials, alongside our first symposium, which you just learned about, we created a YouTube channel where all symposium materials and other activities of the Epidemic Urbanism Initiative would be fully accessible. And of course, we invite you to take a look using the QR code that's on this screen. We also began by posting the recordings of our symposium, closely then followed by recorded responses by public health scholars to each of the 4 sessions that were featured in this symposium. And this was really a beautiful and impactful way of blending architectural history and contemporary public health practice. You can see here on your screen, Dr. Sandro Galea, Dean of the Boston University School of Public Health, and Dr. Dick Jackson, former director of the Center for Disease Control's National Center for Environmental Health, both in the United States, who spoke about urban health and urban design and planning, respectively. From there, we've invited scholars and practitioners to share their reflections on the implications of the pandemic on topics ranging from educational and cultural institutions to the workplace and architectural practice. As of last week, we have over 500 subscribers and over 7,000 views of all the content that's on this site. And over the past year, we've heard from instructors reporting that they are actively using these materials in their classes. And similarly, we invite you to please use and share this resource as well. And continuing on the theme of education and thinking at a more global scale, in July 2020, we partnered with the Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative, GAHTC, to host our second symposium as part of their annual Zoomposium. Our session was titled Global Visions on Cities and Historical Pandemics in the 20th Century, as you can see here. This second symposium reached an even broader global landscape and offered 3 different lenses to explore the historic impact of epidemics, including colonialism, politics, and domestic and community spaces, as a means to explore new stakes and resonances of this topic. In an effort to foreground the voices and contributions of other scholars in our network, we recruited Professor Fariba Zaridbaf from the University of California at Riverside and Dr. Mehreen Chidarazi from the Khalili Collections in London, both of whom had participated in our May symposium to serve as discussants for this panel. And to further our commitment to sharing materials, we published resources that amplify and extend these initial conversations as a 4-part teacher-to-teacher workshop series, which you can find on the GAHTC website. A screenshot of that is available here on your screen. Following these 2 symposia, we really wanted to create a space to confront the persistent issues of social, racial, and economic inequity that we had seen reverberate time and time again from case studies across time and global geographies. So we convened 5 scholars whose work actively engages these issues to participate in a roundtable, including Anne-Marie Akehurst, an independent scholar based in New York, England, Edna Bonholm, a postdoctoral researcher at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, Paulo Hudson, faculty at Columbia University, Daniela Sandler, faculty at the University of Minnesota, and Carlo Trombino, a PhD candidate at the University of Palermo in Italy. Additionally, Dr. Ruth Mackay, an independent scholar based in California, and Emily Webster, a PhD candidate from the University of Chicago, both of whom we worked with in our first symposium, served as discussions for this session. So, seen together, these first symposia and roundtable represent efforts to empower our community members to lead conversations, as well as a deliberate inclusion of both junior and senior scholars. These conversations also convey the continued relevance of and need to center studies about epidemic illnesses, past and present, in scholarship, activism, politics, and all other activities, given their historic as well as ongoing impact, urban life, and form. So now you get to see the book that we've been referencing all along here to further our commitment to public education and really to foreground the importance of relevance in history. We co-edited a book, as you've already heard, which is comprised of 38 chapters, including a prologue by Sandro Galea and an epilogue by Dick Jackson, both of whom you saw in an earlier slide. So this book really asks, how might insights from the outbreak of and response to previous urban epidemics inform our understanding of the current world. So to respond to this question, scholars from a range of disciplines, including architecture, history, public health, sociology, anthropology, and medicine, present historical case studies from across the globe. And importantly, and I want to emphasize this here, these case studies demonstrate how epidemic illnesses and responses to them exploit and amplify social inequality in the communities they touch. I'll just say here that we really wanted to engage a broad readership with this book, and this really inspired us to work in new ways. So for example, chapters are very short. They all follow a very consistent structure and all speak explicitly to present day implications of historic case studies. The book is also really beautifully illustrated with more than 150 historical images. Yet we raised funds to keep the volume affordable, especially in paperbacks, so that this could be as accessible as possible. Each section, I should say, begins with a map to show the geographic context and global range of the case studies in each section. And we added in also a glossary of key terms about illness, public health concepts, and architectural and urban design to ensure that we could speak meaningfully to a range of audiences. We've been really excited to see this book featured in Metropolis and ArcDaily, as well as Inside Higher Ed from my own field. And in each case, this has been a book that's been recommended about the pandemic. But ultimately, success for us is going to be a book that reaches beyond the academy, that keeps our collective focus on epidemics as a fact of urban life, even and especially as vaccines and other interventions bring COVID to an endemic state. And of course, one that inspires meaningful, equitable, and human-centered change. So by January 2021, a year into the pandemic, we began seeing a new wave of articles and essays detailing bold new offices or the future of the future, or maybe bemoaning the final decline of the city. Yet missing from way too many of these treatises was engagement with the specific and divergent realities across the world, or with the need to intervene in the broader architectural, sociological, and climatic structures that will continue to create vulnerabilities to infectious illness. So in response, we decided to turn our focus to the future to convene a symposium, which you can see here, titled International Perspectives on the Future of Architecture and Urbanism in the Post-COVID Age. Spanning 2 days, this symposium, comprised of scholars and practitioners from 20 countries, aimed to confront the impacts of this pandemic on cities and to imagine new possibilities for a post-COVID urban landscape. And we explore topics including like the response to and experience of epidemics, to ecology and sustainability and pedagogy and various design interventions. We also looked at healthcare design, as well as social justice and equity. Importantly, in their presentations, we called on all presenters to focus on empirical observations that inform the visions they advocate for future practice. And we also asked each speaker to begin their talk with a brief overview of the experience or impact of COVID-19 in their local context. In this way, the symposium considered both local and global implications of COVID for a post-COVID era. The symposium also really spoke to and engaged a truly global audience. Speakers came from 20 countries and registrants represented 91 countries. Again, each of these conversations were facilitated by both scholars and practitioners, so a nice blending of positionalities. And of course, recordings of all these conversations are available on YouTube. The symposium model proved really generative for the two of us and for our participants. One of our participants in the symposium reached out to us to say she was especially moved by the opportunity the symposium gave for practitioners and academics to engage in substantive conversation and suggested we do more along these same lines. This ultimately inspired a recent design competition, which we're going to say more about momentarily. Mohammed and I were also very inspired by this really global network. We saw the value of stories being shared from Zimbabwe and the UAE and Trinidad and Tobago and so many more locations across the world. In addition to establishing a formal advisory board to guide the initiative, we also established and recruited a network of regional liaisons from across the world to create this truly global community to engage and also help inform this initiative. We currently have 52 countries represented. You can see a list of just a couple of them here from our website. And we were really excited to convene our first meeting of these liaisons last weekend. We wanted to share these two anecdotes to convey the power of this community to activate new ideas and to help us push the bounds of collaboration and practice to exciting new frontiers. So on that note, what began in the wake of our January symposium as a desire to connect scholars and practitioners in meaningful ways became our design competition in October 2021. And ultimately that became a broader effort to help rethink typical conventions around design competitions. So as you can see here, the goal of this design competition was to provide a setting for collaboration between students and teachers and designers and thinkers and architects and artists and practitioners from a range of disciplines and fields in order to create and discuss conceptual design ideas that explicitly promote healthy places for vulnerable communities. And the call asked participants to consider an underutilized space in their home context to be reimagined and redesigned as one of the following place types in order to promote health among vulnerable local communities and build resilience in anticipation of future epidemics or other disasters. So place types included senior housing, community clinics, neighborhood schools, and public parks. And in this call, I want to underscore that we explicitly encourage collaboration, for example, among students and faculty or across disciplines, or thinking about collaborations between academics and practitioners. And participant submissions were required to take the form of a narrative slide deck, which included words and images to describe the local context, the community or communities of focus, the specific needs or vulnerabilities of these communities, proposed interventions and envisioned outcomes. Juries assessed projects based on a range of human and place-centered factors, as well as the efficacy of the narrative and the visual communication represented in these submissions. Shortlisted teams were then invited to create a brief 2-minute video to describe their work. As you can see here, these are screenshots from submission to the senior housing category. These videos really were an opportunity to see the richness of the local context and to hear from users, both of which really enriched the design narrative and helped to convey the impact and meaning of this work. These videos were shared as part of the review meetings we organized for each category of submissions and broadcasted live and recorded for public access. And importantly, these review meetings, which of course, again, are available on YouTube, represented an opportunity to document juror feedback and to invite and make accessible to broad audiences a conversation engaging proposed design ideas within a broader context of academic, architectural, and public health practice. So it was very exciting to be part of these conversations. So the next set of images I'm going to show you really, I hope, convey the range of the communities and geographies and dimensions of health engaged by and through these projects. So for example, here we see examples from Puerto Rico and from Bangladesh. And here we see a space that's designed for survivors of PTSD. This is a community clinic proposal. And here we just see this beautiful intermingling of a range of communities and nature for a senior housing community. So now kind of shifting gears a bit and relating these practices to the topic of this symposium, we really appreciated this invitation because it was an opportunity for us to reflect on this work that we've been talking about through the lens of care. In other words, it helped us ask, how might we frame these early actions and subsequent activities within the discourses of caring pedagogies and practices? In fact, this paradigm of care is really deeply meaningful to our work. From the beginning, it has felt like each of us in our events were just shouting from the rooftops, like, we all need to care. But of course, what do we mean by care, and who should care, for and about whom? And what or whose actions do we demand in this imperative to care? In the recent book, Care and the City, edited by Angelica Graybauer and colleagues, this book reminds us of the value of seeing care as a productive scholarly frame and convincingly argues that care in the absence of care are really central organizing factors of urban life. The authors also note that COVID has offered a recent and potent reminder about the layers of vulnerability uncovered by the pandemic, yet also of our collective capacity for resilience, for connection, for hope, for adaptation. In other words, we have seen the impact of and potential for new ways to care, new commitments to care, or said another way, we've seen the power of action in service of care. In my field, in educational development, we've been talking a lot about the need need for and value of pedagogies of care, which itself is an action. It's a practice of caregiving. So paraphrasing here, the work of educational scholars like Maiz Imad, Richard Eiler, and Sarah Rose Kavanaugh, we might think of pedagogies of care as involving first empathy for all members of a learning community, including our students and ourselves, which you might think of in the context of the EUI as, listening deeply, as making space for lived experiences in the past and present tense. I was just rereading this morning a publication by Mays Emad, and she talks about the power of empowering students to tell their own stories, right? To make space for them to tell their own stories and for us to bear witness to these accounts. And I think we see here an echo the ways in which we've given voices and platforms to students and junior and senior scholars alike in the initiative. Second, it's important to consider flexibility with regard to course design and expectations. As applied to the EUY, this really points to, I think, the value of finding new ways of working, especially working across contexts and time zones. We've really had to try new approaches and methods and modalities. And that this has really encouraged us to commit to making materials as accessible to public audience as possible. And of course, we've seen this translate into then a variety of teaching and learning contexts, which is really exciting. Peer and community support and empowerment is critical for these pedagogies of care. And really, this has been kind of a guiding principle of our work, as you've seen, of really empowering this network of community members. And then finally, these pedagogies of care remind us to emphasize the human dimensions of connection, of collaboration, and to really underscore our own interdependence. So in the initiative, we really tried to foster connection at a variety of scales, from the very local, such as convening social gatherings to celebrate our collective efforts, like a symposium or the book project, but also to kind of form these global connections through things like our network of liaisons and the meetings that we have and will be continuing to arrange. So caring then means learning about and engaging meaningfully with others, and of course, creating spaces for others to do the same. Caring also is really importantly to act, to advocate, to, in the words, again, of educational scholar Mays Emad, quote, to use our positionalities and proximities to advocate and to act, and in so doing, to envision and to work toward a new future. In this way, the platform and the work for the initiative has really served as a source of resilience for us, and we hope for members, and of course, we also hope for the urban spaces being redesigned and re-inhabited in the wake of this global reckoning. We're keeping our eyes forward, as we hope you've seen, envisioning and advocating a healthier and more just future. And as we say, once again, in the preface to Epidemic Urbanism, we wanted to share this quote with you. This project really makes clear that investing in infrastructure and ensuring access to healthcare and prioritizing affordable and adequate housing for all will be significant steps toward a world in which health-centered and health-promoting design is the norm. Imagine that. It is possible, and I've bolded this here in my script, it is possible to design cities to prevent and mitigate epidemic illness. And we really hope, of course, that the work that we've shared today points to some ways that we're trying to undertake this process. So in this way, we really see Epidemic Urbanism as a hopeful platform. I'm about to end my thoughts here, so we're going to bring this to a close in just a moment. So let me just say once again, that we want to thank and congratulate the symposium organizers once again for this timely and important series of conversations. And in closing, we wanted to reflect also on a conversation that arose in our recent design competition review meetings. In her closing comments, Dr. Naomi Sachs, who served as the commentator in the public parks category, spoke deeply and eloquently about the value of green spaces for city dwellers in particular. One outcome she shared really stood out, and that is that there is good evidence that children who are exposed to nature from a young age grow up to be stewards of green spaces, of the environment. And more than that, they vote, they're community minded, they're civically engaged. In other words, they care. So what might the equivalent of this conversion experience be to necessitate the magnitude of change that we envision post-pandemic? Perhaps this is the most profound call to action, that we have this shared global experience through COVID. We've all witnessed the devastation as well as the power of action. So after centuries of epidemics and the recurring echo of social and physical vulnerabilities that exacerbate these illnesses, we must finally learn these lessons of inequity, of fragility, to undo the uncaring and instead to act, to intervene and to build resilience. So that concludes the comments that we've prepared today, and we're happy to open it up now to questions that you have. And to help get the conversation started, we also would be eager to hear from you about the ways that you see your work, or even some of the work that we've shared today, continuing toward these practices of care. Thank you.
Great. Do you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I would like to invite our audience to raise questions. Actually, there's one question already, I think, in the chat box. Do you see it yourself? Would you like to read it, or would you like me to read it?
I'm happy to read it. So this is from Kivanch. Thanks for this talk. So the question is, one line of inquiry may be the increased pressure on the rural areas with the COVID pandemic. So for instance, people with means in Turkey tend to leave crowded city centers and resettle in or work remotely from less urbanized areas and coastal towns. In doing so, they are also spreading an urban way of life beyond cities, like the culture of consumption, and agricultural areas are turning into housing settlements. So have we observed this global trend? And what might we add to this observation? This is a great question. Mohammed, I wonder if you have thoughts you wanna share here, or does this relate to any conversations maybe that we've seen come up in our work?
I think, I mean, this is a topic that we, kind of tackled in one of the events that we had. And I think it's a fabulous question because, in epidemic urbanism, we started with an emphasis on cities, but very soon we realized that we cannot, just talk about cities. The majority of population in many countries live in rural areas, and that's a very kind of timely topic to address. Talking about crisis and rural areas, I think that's in general, that's something that has happened throughout history, that not only during times of pandemics and epidemics, but also during times of wars and all sorts of other crises in cities. People or the urban settlers temporarily kind of migrated to rural areas, and that created some kind of sometimes tension. So that had some positive impacts as well as negative impacts. So I think what's happening here, there are lots of conversations. The context of the US about how suburbs will change, how the country, the rural areas will change after the COVID. But I think there is a lot of kind of misjudgment here, and there is a kind of, we are not at the end of the crisis, so we really don't know what's going to happen. However, it's really important to think about marginalized communities. And in these cases, many people who live in rural areas, some of them, unfortunately, dealing with suffering from major economic issues, they are at the forefront of dealing with epidemics and the impact of epidemics.
I think such a beautiful point. Yeah, I think just what I'll add is another place where this, where this tension between like sort of the urban and the rural came up is in our design competition. Many of the submissions actually for community clinics were sort of in these rural locales, which was a surprise to us, right? I think we were sort of assuming like, the clinics might need to be dealing with the problems that are uniquely caused through density in urban spaces. But it was a reminder that, to Mohammed's point, that we do need to look at vulnerable communities sort of wherever they are at. And that might be in urban areas, might be in more rural areas. And to see that these resources have to meet people where they're at. So we had a long conversation about, how is the paradigm of healthcare changing, right? Rather than being sort of things like centralized structures that people come to, how do we sort of decentralize that and go out into these communities? So that's a way of saying thank you for this question that I think is helping us see historical trends as well as sort of more future trends with a bit more nuance.
And Caitlin, you raise a very good point. I think one of the beauties of working with this global network has been that many of our colleagues or people who have been submitting papers or entries for the design competition are the ones who have pushed us to look at this issue of care and epidemics in a different way. For example, as you mentioned, when we came up with the design competition, we were mainly thinking of projects in urban settings. But then we ended up receiving many projects from different countries, from Vietnam, from many African countries. And we realized that, the setting that these people have in mind is very different from ours here in the US.
Mm-hmm.
May I continue that with a question?
May I say something
Sure.
before you continue, Erdem Hocam? Should we take down the screen share because you only see in small small windows. Now that's better. While we talking, just talking. That's why. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Sorry for the interruption. I had
no
to
worries.
say it
Thank
so
you.
we can see three of you much more closely and clearly. Thank you so much.
Of course.
I think I have two questions, and this was the issue that you talked about. I mean, the rural areas, the pressure on them, like real estate prices in rural areas, or like seaside places, like shooting through the roof. All of that I think has been taking place. What does the pandemic? Just to read it backwards, what does the pandemic tell us about the nature of globalization? Do you think that when you were going through all these examples, and I think that you are the people to ask the question for, because you saw so many entries, you met with so many people, from different places. What does that teach you about globalization itself? Because we know the theoretical field a little bit, but we never had it tested by means of a pandemic. And there were so many cliches, so many stereotypes, as you talked about. But I think you were kind of, although you were removed, you were in the field, right? I mean, even though you were connected online with these people. What do you think that you would say about the nature of globalization, and what did the pandemic tell you about that?
Maybe I'll just jump in quickly with an initial comment, and then Mohammed, please elaborate. I think one of I guess there's a tension for me that's coming up in thinking about the lessons of globalization, and that on one hand, of course, one of the lessons that we see is that we are more vulnerable through this kind of increasing globalization, right? The flows, the connections, the movements, right? The kind of increasing densities of or collisions of people, kind of at a global scale, of course, is one of the things that contributes to things like infectious disease. But at the same time, it's also this beautiful blessing of connection, right? And I think to your point, maybe Erdem, what I heard in you talking about, what I heard in your question is that certainly through the pandemic, we've had the means to, and maybe the space to be a bit more connected, right? The fact that, I can sit here in New York and be connected to just this this network of liaisons across the world, and we all have this common thing to talk about, which is this absolutely global pandemic. Yet at the same time, I think that there's also a cautionary tale in there that we really can't totalize, right? So I think what we've been trying to show in the initiative is that we have this shared experience, right? COVID has left very few corners of the world untouched, and yet the specific needs, the specific context, the specific experience of that, I think it's important to pay attention to the very local issues. And I think we've been really trying to be mindful of not assuming that the American perspective, or we both are in big cities, that the big city perspective of this, of COVID, or of anything really is shared. So I don't know if that's making sense, but I think there's this duality, right? There's this tension that I think there are connections, but I think there's also so much difference and so much that's unique that I think it's important to hold both of those in tandem. What would you like to share, Mohammed?
One more thing that I want to mention about globalization is that I think we, as people in the 2021 or 21st century, we tend to take ourselves very seriously, as if globalization did not exist in the 12th century or 13th century. And Erdem, you were part of our first conference in which several papers talked about the impact of epidemics in Europe, especially in Europe, on trade routes, right? And one great thing that came up in a few of these conversations that we probably did not feel at that point was that how it affected the prices and the economy within these cities. Now we feel that in the US, and maybe you feel that in Turkey. I mean, the inflation, everyone, you turn on TV, everyone is talking about inflation. But guess what? The same thing happened in 12th century, 13th century, 14th century. We discussed it 12, 13 months ago in the symposium, right? Several papers. So in fact, globalization is not a new phenomenon, but yes, obviously the technology has helped us kind of connect in a much stronger way these days. You call us from Turkey and we are having this conversation, and we could have people from 20, 30, 50 countries in this forum. And maybe after the video is finalized, many people from different countries will watch us, and hopefully they will learn certain things. So that's actually globalization. So maybe globalization has affected the pace of transmission of knowledge, but it has been always a phenomenon in Eastern and Western societies.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'd like to turn to the audience if there are any questions. Maybe people are trying to get ready. Okay. One more thing about the resilience of communities you talked about. How would you evaluate that? Like, did you see any kind of striking difference? I mean, the whole thing, for instance, in the US, when I was there as a student, I remember that social security was a major problem. I mean, it was a kind of paranoia, right? It was unaffordable, and Obama came with Obamacare, and then they tried to reverse it. So that was in itself. I mean, in a society like that, I remember discussing with people about the necessity for social security. A lot of people would say, like, I wouldn't pay out of my pocket for someone else's healthcare and stuff like that. So that's a different culture. Like that's a culture of individualism. That's a different culture. But in your dealing with these different contexts, different localities, how do you see that taking place in other parts of the globe? And do you see the pandemic has actually accelerated or affected some kind of change in the point of view of the people who participated in these events that you organized? I have, the reason why I'm asking the question is that I think, like, and I put it in the chat box, that there's a strong sense of denial, like this is going to go away and business will be as usual. And you marked it in your talk as well. Like it happened again. And did we really learn anything is the question. So how were people reacting?
I mean, I think that's a beautiful question. And I don't know that I have a great response, but I think for me, right, so kind of being a participant in these conversations, being an observer of these conversations, it was, I think it was helpful to sort of see that there's actually nothing special about living through a pandemic. It's been something that's happening time and time again. And so I think for me, that helped me see that there's like this long view there, right? It kind of helped me or forced me to confront the fact that, okay, so this is the first pandemic I've really ever lived through. And this is exactly what everyone's been talking about for a long time. But I think your question, though, is also about the need for us to move beyond individual conversations of resiliency too, right? Which I think are important. Like we do hope that there's this conversion experience of anyone who is attending these symposia, right? That is the power of showing these historical case studies, especially with resonance to the present day. But I think the question really is about how do we build and appreciate collective resilience and understand that really the key to successfully navigating and mitigating the effects of any future crisis, epidemics included, is that it's a topic of community resilience. And how do we see sort of the fact that the inequities that are built into our societies, to our towns, to the physical structures, that's going to make all of us vulnerable. So yeah, I think that's just what I'll say there. But again, it's sort of about, it's easy, I think, especially in our society, in the United States, to kind of think about individual experiences, like we got to be tough and we got to, get through it. But it's so much more than that. And those are the stories I'm hoping to hear more of, I think, as this initiative continues.
I think, I mean, yeah, talking about the epidemics here, I think, I mean, here in the US, in the context of US, I think that the pandemics have highlighted the role of health, individual, mental, emotional. Many of us were not talking about mental health 2 years ago, 3 years ago, right? So, I mean, but now it's much more kind of visible and much more kind of sensible. The other thing is that we always tend to forget that, I mean, yes, now we are dealing with COVID as a main epidemic, but there are other types of epidemics going on. Obesity is such a huge issue in the US. And unfortunately, talking about, these fast food restaurants, unfortunately, it's becoming kind of exported to other regions in the world. Mental health crisis, I mean, people who are feeling more and more kind of isolated, that happened before COVID and now. So hopefully the COVID-19 helps us look at health in a more serious way, so that regardless of our profession, whether we are a historian, whether we are an architect, urban planner, or even, a merchant, we take this more seriously.
Okay. Again, I'm turning to my audience, but anything in the chat box? No, not yet.
Don't see any. I guess what I'll just add too is that we, for this last weekend, we've had a series of conversations that we're really thinking about, I think that there is, especially among younger generations, this desire to change, right? This desire to sort of intervene in these precarities and sort of all the challenges that are confronting us. And so I think that we're really hoping that making these conversations accessible to whomever can access them, I think is really important, right? So how do we also kind of use this as an opportunity to get into curricula, right? To think about not just architectural education as, okay, let's think about this in terms of what the pedagogical practice is, but how do we fundamentally rethink what these practices are? How are similar conversations happening in the field of public health, right? How are we kind of educating and supporting the next generation to have these novel approaches? And I think that's what gives me some hope too, is that I think that there's an opportunity for resilience building there through changing of these practices, through changing of these conversations.
And it all goes back, it all goes back to the topic of this conference, that, in order to be healthier individuals, we need to care about each other, and we are not separate from each other, whether we are in China, US, I mean, regardless of our geography, regardless of our social class, education, we are all part of this bigger community.
Maybe one last thing that you would like to add, the creativity in dealing with pandemics. Like, I mean, since this is a design conference, right? And what did you observe in looking at this global picture? I mean, like, because cultures have different ways of dealing with pandemics, and children, of course, were really seriously affected. I can see it from my daughter here, and maybe there's a field of research there, seeing how they were, how they're going to respond. But just going back to the beginning of the question, I had two things in mind. Sorry, I put them together. But like, did you happen to observe any creative responses or any different responses in, again, this cultural diversity that you had to that you were in contact with? Sorry, like, I mean, well, this was something they were doing which I thought was really interesting.
Without actually referring to any specific examples, and maybe Caitlin may refer to specific examples, I want to mention that the projects that were shortlisted for our design competition, they were amazing because they were extremely creative in dealing with pandemics and this issue of kind of social vulnerability within their communities. So we'll be happy to share the link to these 4 review meetings, because all these, these 4, the shortlisted presentations are there. And yeah, go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, I guess what I'll just say, I think maybe to answer a slightly different question than what you've asked, is that I think that there is profound creativity that we can ignite and amplify if we just simply ask the question of like, your constraint or your problem is health related. And I think I certainly wasn't expecting it. As someone who loves to talk about health, and it's been sort of what has united all of my past experiences. Even I wasn't prepared for how exciting actually it would be to have a conversation about health and to see the creative solutions that are coming about when we're thinking about how do we respond to vulnerabilities. So I hope that that's actually something we can take with us a bit more, right? To ask the question about health, to center to studio projects around this topic that may not seem glamorous, but that it's so essential and that it's the way into people and practices and social contexts and essentially everything. So it's really productive and I think generative lens. And so I think just to answer a different question, I actually would hope that the key words that have come up through this symposium, through this conversation, are ones that can really be used intentionally to inspire this creativity.
Great. If there aren't any questions, I wonder if you'd like to add any last comments. Otherwise, I'm going to say goodbye.
Yeah, just to say thank you so much for this opportunity. Again, we really appreciate the invitation as well as the opportunity to reflect sort of with you all. So thank you for this opportunity. We're deeply honored to be here.
It's our pleasure. And
we are honored, and thanks so much again for the invitation.
Thank you. Okay, so our last words. Thanks everyone for joining Forty's 14th International Symposium. This was it. And I think we heard a great number of very interesting papers, and we ended up, concluding with a wonderful keynote speech that summarized for us the conscious effort of two scholars reaching out to all corners of the globe to kind of raise awareness and turn our eyes towards care. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.